The endgame of the operation in Libya is far from clear. Even American officials acknowledge it could end with Gaddafi still in power. But from past conflicts, we can find clues about when the U.S. military might succeed in its objective and when it won't. Now, for most of the last decade, of course, we've been in Iraq and Afghanistan, long, messy wars where we used massive amounts of ground troops. There's still big questions hovering over the outcomes of those conflicts, but it seems safe to say that does not appear to be a model we would like to emulate. I certainly would not like to emulate it. But there are a big difference between those wars and what's happening in Libya. Iraq was supposedly about weapons of mass destruction. Afghanistan was about hunting down al-Qaeda. At least it was like a decade ago. But the rationale for action in Libya is essentially humanitarian, the protection of civilians from the wrath of Muammar Gaddafi. And in the past, the U.S. has sometimes succeeded in such missions, and sometimes it hasn't. So what lessons can we learn from those conflicts? Well, let's take a look. In 1983, U.S. forces were part of a multinational peacekeeping effort during Lebanon's civil war. In October of that year, an attack on the barracks killed 241 American troops. Shortly later, Americans withdrew ground forces. The civil war dragged on for 7 more years. Lesson? Don't send in troops that are sitting ducks in the middle of a civil war with no plan. The U.S. intervened in the early 90s in Somalia as part of the United Nations coalition. Operations there included the Battle of Mogadishu, in which 18 Americans were killed and 2 Black Hawk helicopters were shot down. Afterwards, President Clinton directed the military to stop all fighting in Somalia except in self-defense. Somalia's civil war continues to this day. Hundreds of thousands have died. Lesson? Don't send in troops and Black Hawk helicopters into the middle of a civil war with no plan. Now, the U.S. didn't take action during the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. An estimated 800,000 people were killed in the span of just a few months. Lesson there? If you sit it out, be prepared to deal with the fact that you did nothing as hundreds of thousands of people died. Now, the Bosnian War was one conflict in which international efforts did eventually put an end to genocide. Peacekeeping missions intensified over a 3-year period starting in 1992. NATO finally brought the conflict to an end by enforcing a no-fly zone with airstrikes, but not before thousands of civilians had been massacred. Slobodan Milosevic signed the Dayton Accords that brought peace in 1995. NATO's no-fly zone and airstrikes played a decisive role in the Balkans again just a few years later in the Kosovo War in 1999. In that case, NATO's bombing campaign led to Serbian forces withdrawing from Kosovo and eventually the downfall of Milosevic. Lesson? Well, it turns out no-fly zones can work, even if they are sometimes messy and take a while to enforce. The question is, when they work, why do they work? With me now is MSNBC military analyst and retired Army Colonel Jack Jacbos and Juan Cole, professor of history at the University of Michigan. They're going to help me try to answer that question. So, Colonel Jacbos, let me start with you. What do you think we gained from those lessons of Bosnia and Kosovo? What do we learn from that success that we can apply to Libya?
Well, if we remember what we did and what we didn't do, it's useful, but we frequently don't do that. There are a couple of lessons here. The first is that air power and air superiority are very useful and sometimes essential, and they can really have a big impact on whether or not your goals are achieved, but they can't do it by themselves. More likely than not, if you have a situation like we have now, and a lot of these other places we've seen, you have to put boots on the ground. That means that you're going to be involved in whatever is taking place on the ground, and you don't want to do that unless you're prepared to wait it out for a long period of time. So you got to start at the end and work backwards. It's the objective first. What are you trying to achieve? And until you answer that, you can't use military force in any case because you don't have an objective. And sometimes when we fail, it's because we use military force without an objective.
Right. Now, Professor Cole, let me go to you. Now, I know that General Clark, when he was enforcing the no-fly zone in Kosovo, says that ground troops, at least the threat of ground troops on the border, made a big difference. Do you think we can pull this thing off without at least the threat of ground troops?
Well, it depends on what you want to pull off. If what you want to do is protect the people of Benghazi from being conquered from having tank shells fired into civilian crowds from being massacred, then yes, we can do that from the air because smart munitions can take out Gaddafi's tanks near to Benghazi, and that's what the French did on Sunday. If the objective is to overthrow the Gaddafi regime, then doing that kind of thing, taking territory, getting rid of regimes without boots on the ground, is almost impossible.
See, okay, so we have agreement on that, and we've seen, and as we showed in the intro there, once we have troops on the ground, it's a disaster 9 out of 10 times, it seems like.
Well, unless you're willing to put lots and lots of troops on the ground.
Which we did in Iraq and Afghanistan, it was still a disaster.
We never put enough, and we didn't, the objective did not match the force that we had, but you're right, that's why you got to start at the end and work.
So if you guys are both saying, hey, ground troops are a disaster, but we can separate them, and it looks like we've begun to separate them, right? So Colonel Jacobs, what do you think is the ultimate answer here? Do we have 2 different states, or how long can we go with a no-fly zone if they've got a long war as Gaddafi's promising?
Well, no-fly zone. It costs a lot of money to shoot Tomahawks. They cost almost $1.5 million a piece, and we can fire at them with the munitions on planes, and we can wait them out. We can do this for a long, long time. The politics aside, the fact of the matter is not going to change the things on the ground. What really has to happen is that the rebels have to get arms. They need ammunition. They need training. They need leadership. They need an objective. Just encouraging them to do better, giving them impetus, because we've removed a lot of the forces that are against them, is not going to make them successful.
Well, Professor Cole, real quick, so what's our options here? Is it realistic to think about assassination? Is it to get a mutiny from the troops, the mercenaries that are supporting Gaddafi? Or do we just say, hey, you know what, Gaddafi's going to stay there, we're just separating the 2 sides?
Well, I think it's unpredictable, and when you go into this kind of situation, you don't know what's going to happen. What I would say is that we should stick to the mission to the extent the U.S. is involved, and it may not be involved that long. Its mission should be humanitarian. If Gaddafi looks like he's going to massacre people, he should be stopped from doing that. How the Libyans work out their subsequent political arrangements should be up to the Libyans, and I'm not so pessimistic about the possibility that the rest of the Libyans will throw Gaddafi under the bus over time. It should be remembered just 2 weeks ago, even 3 weeks ago, it looked like Gaddafi was toast. So many people in the country had turned against him. It's only the deployment of his tanks and air force that turned that around for him. If you take those out of the equation, which is what the UN is doing, then it may well be that he can't survive.
All right, and we'll of course follow it. Very interesting. Colonel Jacobs and Professor Juan Cole, thank you both so much.